All right, let's hear this interview with Professor Edward Feser. Recently, I made a tremendous discovery in the works of Dr. Edward Feser. I was just looking to refresh my memory about Thomas Aquinas, and I got a beginner's guide. That's what it was called, a beginner's guide to Thomas Aquinas. I was a couple of pages in when I suddenly thought, wow, this guy is really good. He is not just a guy giving me a beginner's guide. This is really intense, intelligent philosophy. And I picked up his book, The Last Superstition, which is a refutation of the new atheism, the guys like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and all this. Wonderful, wonderful book that speaks so much into the trouble in our times and what has gone wrong with the thinking in our times. Dr. Edward Feser has a new book called 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. I have forced his work on Shapiro, who actually likes it as well. And I'm really thrilled to have you in the studio. It's great to meet you.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
It really was one of those things where I was halfway through The Last Superstition and I thought, oh, you know, this is what I've been trying to see, what I've been trying to say, but I didn't have the kind of background in philosophy that you have. I didn't have that vast knowledge, and I didn't put it together. You did that thing that writers do, where you express the thing that was in my head that I couldn't say. It's really wonderful. So let's see if I can get you to communicate some of this to my audience. They're low lifes and troglodytes, slavering troglodytes.
Well, I've been called that, so I think I can relate.
You should be right at home on my program. One of the things I talk about a lot is the fact that we now not only live in a society that doesn't value truth, we live in a society that basically tells you you're virtuous if you lie. If you say that a man in a dress is a woman, then you are a good person. If you say, you know what, he's just a guy in a dress, then you're a bad guy. In your book, in The Last Superstition, you trace the failure of philosophy. You trace a philosophy gone wrong. And it basically has to do with what you call and what is called teleology. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, let me give it a shot. So one of the big themes of the book, as you know, is the idea that in modern times, and by modern times I mean the last 350 years or so, a picture of nature, of the natural world of our universe, has come to dominate Western thought, which the architects of that view called the mechanical world picture, the mechanical philosophy. It's the idea that the world is a vast machine, a vast mechanism, right? So that just like you can explain the operation of a watch, the movement of the hands and so forth, and the gears in terms of the turning of smaller gears and ultimately a mainspring and so forth, and you ultimately don't have to make reference to purpose or meaning or value or anything like that. The idea is that the physical world is a mechanism of that sort ultimately, so that any mark of purpose, any mark of intelligence, anything that smacks of design or order or what have you is ultimately a kind of illusion. And what lays beneath the illusion is simply a clockwork world of meaningless particles in motion and so forth. So the idea of objective value, the idea of objective purpose, that things in the natural order, that biological functions, that human organs and so forth have any sort of objective purpose that they aim to, that could entail a difference, an objective difference between good and bad, better and worse, right and wrong. That disappeared with this idea that the world is really just a meaningless machine, meaningless particles in motion. And so with the dominance of that model, the idea that value and purpose are simply a projection of the mind, they're not really out there. We don't discover them, we invent them, we make them up, has been a byproduct of that.
So how did that happen? I mean, it seems obvious to me that, water is for drinking, that hands are for holding, the heart pumps blood. How could they have come to that conclusion? What happened?
Well, what happened in a nutshell is essentially that the originators, or at least many of the originators of this picture, people like Descartes and Newton and so forth, they themselves wouldn't deny that things have purposes, that there is real meaning and purpose, or as you put it, teleology in nature, goal-directedness. But what they wanted to say is that for scientific purposes, they decided they were going to redefine science. We're going to ignore that. We're going to focus only on those aspects of the natural world which we can study and which we can define apart from reference to purposes and goals and ends and so forth, and meaning. And the reason, and so in particular, they were going to focus on what you could put in the language of mathematics. So mathematics became the language in which the book of nature was said to be written, as Galileo famously put it. So that if you couldn't put something in the language of mathematics, then at least for scientific purposes, we're not interested in it. let the philosophers deal with that. But the earliest writers who took this view, again, people like Newton and Descartes, they didn't deny that there was something there that could only be captured in non-mathematical language. They just decided, for scientific purposes, we're going to ignore that, because they wanted to reorient science to be a tool by which we could develop new technologies and master nature and so on and so forth. And for that narrow purpose, appeals to purposes and meanings weren't necessary. All you needed to do was to predict and control nature and focus on those aspects which could be mathematically quantified as the key to predicting and controlling nature.
So that makes perfect sense. A guy who's standing at the plate trying to hit a baseball isn't thinking about how to make his wife happy. It was just a way to do something specific thing. But ultimately, it basically killed the whole idea of reason, meaning, and of God, too.
Yes, because what happened is the method turned out to be tremendously successful, needless to say. When you're focused intently only on those purposes, only on those aspects of nature that you can precisely predict and control, that you can put in the language of mathematics, naturally you're going to find those. You're much more likely to find them if you make sure that's all you're going to look for. So modern science has been tremendously successful in finding those aspects of nature that could be precisely predicted and controlled. We've developed tremendous technologies like the ones we're making use of right now on the basis of that. And so science has given us tremendous practical advantages. So far, so good, no problem. But what the problem comes in when people start drawing the inference, as over the centuries people increasingly have, that since science is so successful from a practical point of view and a technological point of view, then anything that's not science, that doesn't have that sort of practical technological application, must be intellectually second rate. It must not be really capturing anything there is to reality. But that's just a fallacy. As I like to put it, it's like someone who uses a metal detector, right, to find metal, and let's say he develops a metal detector that's so powerful he can find any bit of metal in any beach anywhere, right? It's like concluding from the fact that metal detectors that his metal detector is so successful in finding metals that there's nothing else to be found, right? That wood doesn't exist, stone doesn't exist, and that somehow if you criticized him and said, well, that's a silly argument, he'd say, well, so you're denying, right, that my metal detector finds metals,
you
right?
believe in science.
And you want to find your keys too. You make use of my metal detector when it suits your purposes, but suddenly, in other cases, you want to start talking about wood and stone and these fairy tales, right? Well, it's the same kind of argument that happens when people say that if it's not analyzable in scientific terms, in the language of mathematical physics, it must not be real. That's like saying, again, that if it can't be discovered by a metal detector, it must not be real, because after all, metal detectors work so well. They're tools. Science is a tool.
So basically, this is almost an accidental wrong turn in the history of thought. I mean, it is a useful device that became the entire highway of thought that people went down.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so people understand why this is important. The idea of teleology, the idea that things have a purpose, that we have a purpose, that we have a goal. It's very strongly connected to natural law. When our founders were writing about nature and nature's God, this is what they were talking about, teleology.
And this is an idea that goes back. I mean, what it is, it's a kind of intellectualization or a philosophical articulation of something everybody knows in common sense life. And that is that the difference between good and bad and right and wrong and so forth ultimately is a reflection of whether we're acting in a way that's in conformity to the purposes for which we exist by nature, the purpose of our natural faculties and so forth. So everybody knows, for example, that eyeballs are made for seeing, and that if you behave in a way that frustrates that goal or purpose of the eyes, that's bad for you, because part of what's good for you is defined by what's good for your eyes, what's good for your teeth, what's good for your body. When it comes to the body, when it comes to just straightforward medical questions, everybody acknowledges this, that we have to pay attention to, we have to show respect for the natural functions, the natural purposes that are inherent in human nature, the bodily side of human nature. But when it comes to other moral issues, people start to forget this, and they start to talk as if purposes and ends and goals somehow built into nature, that's just kind of an illusion, that it's not really there.
So this kind of thinking led you to become a Catholic, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a long story, but the short version of it, because I was an atheist for about 10 years during the 90s. 90s were a weird decade for a lot of us, right? So during the 90s, but what happened is when I was in grad school, and not really as a result of anything that I was doing in the classroom or when I was working on my dissertation, but rather extracurricular activity, essentially preparing for lectures, because in my introduction to philosophy classes, and of course I was teaching on philosophy of religion, I had to teach Aquinas. And it got boring, because at the time I was a skeptic, I was an atheist. It got boring just talking about how dumb the arguments were. I mean, I try to be polite and non-polemical in the classroom, but it got boring just lining Aquinas' arguments up and shooting them down and pointing out how silly they were. And I thought, well, this doesn't really convey to students why anybody would take any of this stuff seriously. And by all accounts, Aquinas was a smart guy. So if I can see, or an 8-year-old could see flaws in the arguments, or at least what many people think are flaws in his arguments, that doesn't give students an understanding of why anybody would consider this guy a great thinker. So I thought, what I'm going to do is I'm going to revisit Aquinas. I'm going to try to sell him, right, to the students. Even though I didn't believe his views. I wanted to kind of give him a run for his money in the classroom and try to make the students understand why anybody would take Aristotle or Aquinas or any of those thinkers seriously. And so I got back into the study of Aristotle and Aquinas, got back into the literature, and I started to see that a lot of the stock objections to their view of the world, whether it's their arguments for God's existence or ethics or whatever, were directed at caricatures. They were based on crude misunderstandings. And so I went from thinking, well, actually these arguments are a little better than I'd given them credit for. You can kind of present an interesting lecture on them. Over time that became, well, actually these arguments are pretty interesting. They're pretty challenging. Yeah. And then that eventually transformed into the conclusion that, well, these arguments are actually, they're really powerful. They're really strong arguments. And eventually it just hit me. They were right all along.
Oh, wow.
And I was wrong. Now there's more to the story, but that's kind of the short version of it, that I was converted in the course of trying to get other people to see why anybody would have taken this stuff seriously. I ended up converting myself inadvertently.
That's really fascinating. And the church does represent, it represents a protector and a vessel of natural law theology.
Yeah.
And it goes back, it has included through Aquinas, it's included Aristotle.
Right.
It's brought him into the form of thing. When you pick up whatever nowadays passes for a newspaper, and you're reading the news of the day or you're watching the news of the day, what are the things that leap out at you as part of this problem, part of this mistake where we turned away from teleology to this mechanistic viewpoint? Where are there things that you see where you go, that's what I'm trying to talk about, that is the thing?
Well, sure. Probably the most obvious example would be the controversy that's arisen in really such an amazingly speedy fashion in the last 2 or 3 years over transgenderism, and this visceral hostility to the very idea that there's any such thing as an inherent natural difference between men and women, say, right? To the point where it's not even considered a legitimate subject of debate. It's not that, well, look, we've got some very challenging ideas, hold on, folks, this is going to sound strange, but we think this is correct, we understand you're going to be resistant, but hear us out. No, it's you must go along with this or you're a bigot, you're stupid, you are uninformed, you're not scientific or what have you, and debate is shut down. It's silenced. And that would probably be the most extreme example of the way in which the very idea that there's no such thing as nature, there's no such thing as human nature that we're answerable to or that defines what's good or bad for us, way in which it's manifest. What's interesting, though, is how inconsistent people are in this. They never really take it to its logical conclusion, because if you're really going to deny that there's any such thing as an objective difference between good and bad, or let's say there's an objective end or goal or purpose that our different natural powers and our different natural faculties are directed, you're going to find, I would argue, and I do argue this in the last Superstition, that really takes down everything. That takes down all morality, including moral principles that everybody is still committed to.
Right.
And I think the reason people don't see that is they know that most people, for example, are against murder, right? And so they think, well, we all know murder's wrong. That's not a matter of controversy. So there's a clear difference between that and some of the principles of traditional sexual morality, say, that they don't like. But what they don't realize is all that means is that, yes, people agree that murder is wrong. The question, though, is can they rationally justify that? And if you undermine the whole idea of natural law and the whole idea that there's sort of a natural end or goal that we're built for, then I think you're going to find, to be consistent, you take down the rational justification for morality in general, whether it has to do with murder, stealing, or what have you.
Right.
And there's the illusion that you don't take those things down is there only because most people don't want to take it
It's
that
habitual.
far. It's habitual,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Right.
No, I mean, that's what one of the things that stopped me from being an atheist, and in my atheist period, was reading the Marquis de Sade and thinking, you know what, if there is no God, he's right.
Yeah.
And he's obviously not right.
Right.
And that was,
Right.
and that he basically was
Yeah.
making that same argument. Let me put forward something that has always bothered me about the natural law arguments. And I believe that there is coming in the person of people like yourself, an intellectual religious revival. I do not believe the arguments for atheism can stand, and I believe that people like you who are deeply read in philosophy and deeply read in the literature are going to start to say, you know what, just what you said, this makes more sense. Whenever I hear people talk about natural law, it always seems to me that they use it instantly to justify what the kids call norm core, vanilla morality. And it does seem to me that the world is full of a number of things. And, I'm an artist. I've lived all my life among gay people and eccentrics and crazy people and have loved them all. They've been a wonderful part of my life. It always seems to me that the idea of things having a purpose can be limiting beyond what is intended to, in ways we're not intended to be limited. So just to give you an example, my computer has a purpose. But if I walk outside and somebody tries to mug me and I hit him with the computer,
Right.
the computer's purpose is taken over by my purpose of self-defense.
Right.
So if a person finds in his life that he is the sort of person who falls in love with people of the same sex, now, we may say to him, look, a life lived in bathhouses, screwing people you've never met before is a bad life, and we can show you why. But can he not be allowed to subsume the purpose of his generative organs into expressing love for the person he loves? I mean, it just seems to me, it seems to me that what would be true of me and my wife now that we can no longer have children, but we can still express love in that way, would then be true for this gay couple as well.
Yeah. Okay. So let me address that. There are a number of sub questions in your larger question. So I want to say a little bit about all of them. The first is that you're certainly correct that when people hear natural law, they automatically think sex. Right? So they think if you're defending natural law, you must be obsessed with sexual questions. And that's not the case. I mean, even if you just look at a textbook on ethics written in the natural law tradition from the 1950s or the 1940s, right? There'll be material in there on sexual morality, but it might be one chapter out of 20, literally, right? So it's never been the main focus. I think the reason people think of it as the main focus is because it's the part of natural law, traditional natural law theory they don't like. So they jump on that and think that, well, you guys are obsessed with this, when the natural law theorists would say, well, no, the subject's just one issue we're interested in, but we're not, that we have something to say about, but it's not our main focus, and it's, it's one of 20 different issues, say. Okay, so part of what I want to say then is that the characterization is unfair, that you're right, it is the standard characterization, but I think that it's the case where people are projecting their own interests onto the natural law theorists. So they're focusing that part of traditional theory they don't like, and they magnify that into the whole. Okay. Second point is that you raise the issue of the way in which natural purposes might limit what we might do. And you gave the computer example. You might use the computer to confront an attacker, use it as a weapon, right? Now, there are a number of issues that are concerned with that particular question. There's a difference between, something like the way you might use an artifact, the way you might use one of your own organs, say. But putting that aside for the moment, the natural law position on these sorts of issues, it's not that it's intrinsically wrong to use an artificial device, say. For example, glasses are artificial in the sense that they're man-made, but they don't frustrate the natural end of the eyeballs. In fact, they either restore the natural function or they enhance it, right? So no problem there. What's a problem is only when we do something that's positively contrary, or it positively frustrates the natural end of some human faculty. And merely enhancing our faculties or using them for some purpose other than what they were naturally made for, there's no violation of natural law in that. So we have to distinguish between acting in a way that's contrary to or positively frustrates a natural end on the one hand, and merely using a natural faculty or capacity for something other than its natural end. So that's a second point. The third point is you raised this issue, and it's commonly raised, between this issue about the analogy between an infertile couple or a couple who's they're far along enough in years where the wife's not going to get pregnant anymore, or what have you. And how is that different from a gay couple, say? The difference that traditional natural law theorist argues is it's best understood by analogy with an eyeball, say, that stopped functioning. So even a blind person, if his eyes have stopped functioning, the eyes still have as their natural function or purpose seeing.
Right.
It's not that someone whose eyeballs can no longer work, that they've got a different natural end or purpose than someone whose eyeballs still work. They still have the same natural purpose, the same natural end. They're aiming toward the same outcome, but they're just no longer capable of reaching it, say. So the sexual faculties, according to natural law theory, are like that. They have a certain natural end or outcome that they're aiming for, even if in some individuals, it's not possible for them to reach that anymore. Nevertheless, that's still what they're aiming for. And what they're aiming for in, say, the normal case, in the standard case, is what defines the good or bad use of a natural end or a natural function. And that includes, the functions at just the raw biological level and also at the psychological level. Our tendency, say, to want to bond with another human being in a romantic way and so forth. The argument is that itself exists for the sake of uniting a couple in a way that, in the ordinary course of things, results in children. And so they need to be united for that, lifetime bond for the sake of the stability of the family, good of the children, and so on and so forth. So that even though some individuals may not, they may have psychological tendencies that go in some other direction, that would be analogous to, say, the way an individual person's eyeballs might not be functioning properly, say.
Okay. Well, I wish I could talk to you about this for another 20 minutes, but I can't. I want to hear about your new book, The Five Proofs of the Existence of God. I know it's Aquinas who wrote the five proofs, but this goes beyond that, basically.
Yes. Now, the book's called Five Proofs of the Existence of God. It's not actually on Aquinas' 5 ways, though there's some overlap. I mean, a couple of the arguments I treat are arguments that Aquinas gives. As a matter of fact, the original plan for the book was to call it 4 Proofs, because I didn't want to make it 5 and then think I don't want people to think now Feser's giving his 5 ways, right? It just sounded a little too pretentious. So, but the problem was, as I was writing it, I thought, no, there's this 5th argument that I think is really important and I want to bring into the book. So, okay, I'm just going to go with 5 proofs. So there's overlap with Aquinas, but it's not actually on Aquinas. And the arguments are arguments that are there in the tradition. They're not original with me. None of them is original with me. But the presentation is mine. And the depth and detail in which I present and try to defend the arguments, I don't think you'll find elsewhere. And so there are arguments that go back to, in some version or other, to Aristotle, to Plotinus, who was a Neoplatonic philosopher, follower of Plato, to St. Augustine, to Thomas Aquinas, and to Leibniz, early modern German philosopher Leibniz.
Wow, this sounds great. Dr. Edward Feser, if you are interested in these questions at all, and I hope you are, you want to read The Last Superstition, 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. Terrific books, really deep, will change the way you read the newspaper. If you read the newspaper, it will change the way you look at the news and look at the questions that are out there in front of us. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you.
And I hope you'll come back. We'll talk again.
Thank you.
I'm really glad I got so involved in that I kind of lost track of time, but I was really glad we did.